Welcome to Beyond the Balance Sheet, the podcast that helps advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families understand the complexities of issues related to our mental, physical, and emotional well-being. Our co-hosts, Arden O'Connor and Diana Clark, will interview a series of guests on a range of topics, providing informative content and practical tools for professionals and families to consider. Here are your hosts, Arden and Diana.
Hi, and welcome to an episode of Beyond the Balance Sheet podcast. I'm really excited about our guest today, Dr. Emeran Mayer, a gastroenterologist, neuroscientist, and distinguished research professor at the Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He is one of the pioneers and leading researchers in the bidirectional communication with the brain-gut microbiome system, with wide-ranging applications in intestinal and brain disorders. He's published over 410 scientific papers, books, and is currently working on a PBS documentary about the mind-gut connection. Thank you, Doctor, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure.
So you wrote a book called The Mind-Gut Connection, How the Hidden Conversation Within Our Bodies Impacts Our Mood, Our Choices, and Our Overall Health. First, I want to know, why did you write the book? And then we can talk about what the book relays.
Well, I've always had the wish to write a book. Long before, even when I was still in medical school, and but the actual event that triggered this particular book was that we published a scientific paper on showing the effect of the ingestion of a probiotic cocktail in healthy young women on brain networks and brain functioning. So after this paper was published, there was an unexpected storm of interest from literary agents, from publishers, and so it took about a year of negotiations until I had a deal. Very surprising that I got such a deal for a first-time author. And then it took me another year to write the book. And it got me into a totally different world of authorship, very different from the scientific world.
I am sure of that. I'm sure the writing itself was different because you're writing for a different audience, right?
Yeah, the writing style was very different. I wasn't used to that at all. I think it was a real good experience, a learning experience that, made it much easier when I wrote my second book, that got the immune connection. So that, like all the learning process from the first one helped to do that. But I have to say that that first book was kind of a combination of the science that we had published, but also there was a lot of autobiographical stuff in it, so it was fun to write it.
That's great. So in our culture, we like to think of issues that occur above the neck, right, and issues below the neck. Can you talk to us about the relationship between the whole body, the emotional and physical health system? Because we can't cut them off in certain ways like that.
Yeah, so this dichotomy in brain and mind and body, it's the famous Cartesian split from this famous French philosopher who basically left the brain and everything the brain was thought to do, like spiritual, religious activities, to the church, and the body to science. And surprisingly, that split has really persisted for several centuries, and is still really prevalent today in medical school curricula. It's present in the way many psychiatrists see patients. They just look at what's above the neck and don't pay that much attention to what's below the neck. And whereas, the medical practitioners say do the opposite. They ignore the brain, and it's gradually changing. So there's the gradual evolution to a more holistic view of brain-body interactions and mind-body interactions. I would say mind-body interactions has always been kind of a popular topic amongst amongst healers and people outside the traditional medical system. So what's now gradually getting accepted is that the brain and the body are closely interconnected, and within the body, it's particularly the gut, which is really the focus of my book, that has the most amazing connections, bidirectional connections with the brain.
Can you give me an example of what that would look like?
So, you can look at this in different ways. You can look at it, anatomically. So we now know that there's pathways, for example, the vagus nerve that transmits signals from the gut to the brain. And there's the autonomic nervous system that sends signals from the brain down to the gut. And this is a circular communication system. Whatever happens in the brain has a reflection at the gut level. Whatever happens at the gut level has a reflection in the brain. And that's why I call these interactions not just the brain-gut axis, but a brain-gut system. And what we have missed in this model that I've kind of pursued in my career for the last several decades, but what we have missed until about 10 years ago was the role of the microbes in those bidirectional communications between the brain and the gut. And just give you a few examples, so beyond this communication pathway, the vagus nerve, the gut is a pretty unique organ. It's not there just for digestion. And if something goes wrong, we stick an endoscope in it and look for ulcers or inflammation or tumors. It's a system that's composed of multiple components. It has about 80% of the body's immune system in it. It has the biggest nervous system outside of our brain in it, with 100 million neurons or nerve cells. It has one of the biggest hormonal systems in it, like all the hormones that play a role, for example, in satiety and makes you stop eating, are in the gut. And then we have the 40 trillion microbes that live in this system and communicate with all these other cells I told you, with the immune cells, the endocrine cells, and the nerve cells. So you could almost say it's another little, the way that I look at it in terms of system biology, it's a system with multiple connections, and it has two hubs in it. One is the brain, and the other one is the gut. And that system plays a fundamental role in maintaining our, what we call homeostasis, the balance of all systems, from the nutritional standpoint, from the emotional standpoint. We wouldn't have suspected this in Western medicine, this complexity, but hundreds of years ago, philosophers said all diseases start in the gut. So ancient healing systems have recognized that very same system and its complexity. In Western medicine, because of this dichotomy between brain and body and gut, it never really became sort of an important concept until now. And now I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, this interest has exploded. It was a very interesting phenomenon for me, having followed this concept both in my research and with my patients, but never really got traction in the scientific community and the medical community, that this is now happening at what speed and intensity is really remarkable. So
Absolutely. You were a real pathfinder in this conversation. And I think that your book, your conversation, your papers have gotten people talking, but I'll bet you felt like you were whistling in the dark in the beginning.
Yeah, and if that microbiome revolution, that really triggered the interest, quite honestly. If it hadn't been for surprisingly, hadn't been for the microbes, people would still not be interested in it.
So what's a microbe? I'm going to back us up even further. For our audience who are not medical professionals or scientists, what's a microbe?
So microbial organisms are the bacteria. The most important form is a group called archaea. There's viruses. So there's a range of microorganisms that all live in our gut, and that somehow have established a symbiotic way to live together and benefit each other. It's a clear symbiosis, for example, between the viruses and the bacteria and the fungi and the bacteria. So you almost have to look at this as our gut is kind of a country that hosts with
it's an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem with its own natural flora and fauna, right?
Yeah, so it's there's no flora, so there's no plants in it,
Okay, but I'm thinking in that way.
Definitely, the ecosystem concept is clearly something that totally applies to looking at this, and it's also reflected like in the scientific expression. So now we call about the brain connectome, which means that all the cells and networks in the brain are interconnected. I picked up this term, the gut connectome, because all these cell types that I mentioned to you are connected with each other. And there is the microbiome and the virome, that there are all these ecosystems that overall, work together, and ultimately to understand how they function and how they disturbances in this function happens, and causing disease, like cancer, like diabetes, metabolic syndrome. I think we're really going to come to a full understanding of that only once we understand the complexity of these various ecosystems that exist within us.
So it makes sense to me that the gut would control, diabetes or some of the more organ-related issues. But what does disorder in the gut, and I'm using that word, how does that impact our emotional health, and what are the symptoms we would tend to see?
Again, it's I would come back to this. So anything that happens in the brain, like within our emotional circuits within the brain, it creates a mirror image in our face. People are familiar if they look at somebody, they can tell if this person is sad or angry or anxious. Just looking at the face, and it's created by the facial muscles, which reflect the ongoing activity within these brain circuits. But you have to imagine exactly the same thing happens at the gut level. So these emotions that you see on the face and that start within the brain create this mirror image at the gut level, and it changes everything that goes on down there. It changes the blood flow, it changes the contractions, it changes the secretion of acid or mucus, and it also changes the habitat of the microbes, because they're really adapted to living with the gut that they're used to. So if all of a sudden you develop PTSD or develop depression, all of a sudden they live in a different environment in the gut. And so that's the top down. But then this top down influence doesn't stay in the gut. it influences cells like the hormonal cells in the gut and the microbial cells that live there, that produce substances, chemicals that feed back to the brain, either through the vagus nerve or through the systemic circulation. So there's multiple communication pathways that feed back what happened in the gut back to the brain, and it reinforces this in a circular way. So if you have an emotion of anxiety, depression, anger, it doesn't just happen at the brain level. It starts at the brain, but then it reverberates throughout the whole brain gut microbiome system and ultimately creates this this emotional state. And the question is, the brain could do all this by itself. For a long time, until 10 years ago, we never thought about a potential role of the microbes in this. So there's elaborate neurobiological psychiatric theories, how emotions are generated and how early life experiences shape the emotions. And so all of a sudden you throw in this whole new part into it, which is massive in terms of numbers, 40 trillion cells. And so now I think we're gradually developing a different concept of emotion, something that goes on within us, but then there's also the projections and the feedback from the outside world. So, we're fully integrated in there's not, emotions are not just something that happens at the brain level. A brain in a bottle would not function the same way as our brain that's deeply embodied, in our body, and it's deeply ingrained in the environment as well. So and I always feel, many of these concepts actually, they have existed in Ayurvedic medicine and in Hippocratic medicine, in traditional Chinese medicine. It's just something that we have been blind to, since the Renaissance, since our modern, solely scientifically based medicine, came to age. And now we're returning to it, incorporating these more holistic, what we now call systems-based concepts.
And it makes so much sense. The other assumption doesn't make sense, but I know that that's where we lived. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very not a surprise that we have not been very successful in developing effective therapies for depression. The same basic molecules that are targeted at the serotonin system have been around for decades. The same thing with anxiety. And now we're realizing that other types, holistic therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy or stress reduction using your body as well, are an important component. And we even...
And then, just to interrupt, so those therapies aren't just dealing with the neck up, they're actually calming the whole system, correct? Which is why
Exactly.
The feedback loop stays clear. Yeah.
So breathing, moving the diaphragm has a very important effect in regulating vagal tone, and calming the mind. But then there's also these new exciting approaches that have come about in psychiatry primarily. There's a concept now called nutritional psychiatry, that the kind of diet that we eat has an influence on emotional function, and that an effective treatment for anxiety and depression and schizophrenia and others benefits from having a nutritional component in it. So something that was unthinkable, really, I would say 10 years ago. And then we also have other plant-based therapies that are evolving rapidly, like all these psychedelic, mushroom therapies that are coming, which I'm convinced this has not happened yet, but I'm absolutely convinced that they also affect the gut, because the same receptors that these psychedelics affect in the brain are in the gut, in the enteric nervous system, and probably also even on microbes. So I think the apparent effectiveness of these new therapies are based on a shared set of language molecules, and receptors that exist both at the brain level and at the gut level and the microbial level.
So what I'm hearing is both the brain and the gut speak mushroom, and so that they can both receive the benefit potentially, or whatever the medicine is designed to do.
Yeah, there's still a long way to go, but I mean, mushrooms also have very interesting pharmaceutical properties that, different mushrooms have different nutritional components and molecules that have a health benefit, but also they have these effects on the brain that we don't know why evolution came up with that design. Why would our human brains respond to something that grows in the forest? So it's an interesting time. It's kind of a revolutionary time, and the brain gut microbiome science is definitely a new science that is pushing the limits on that.
Before we leave today, what I'd love to know is what steps can we change or take to achieve optimum health, taking the brain-gut system into account?
Well, there's a simple answer, and that would be, but it's a reductionistic answer. That would just say eat a healthy diet and exercise on a regular basis. Healthy diet means a diet that is targeted to provide optimal health to your gut microbial ecosystem, because microbes love fiber and microbes love these polyphenol molecules. Both of these are mainly contained in a plant-based diet. So sticking to a largely plant-based diet is probably the best thing that you can do. Obviously, you need to make sure you get enough omega-3 fatty acids, but it's fairly simple, if you stick to that. Avoid highly processed. Avoid the standard American diet with all its downsides. Don't want to get into that. The other thing is the exercise, and the exercise is both the vigorous exercise that you would do in the gym or running or biking, which you should do 5 days a week for at least an hour, and push up your heart rate. And then there's the other interesting thing is, we've gone into such a sedentary lifestyle in the last 75 years, which paralleled the deterioration of our diet. So interrupting your daily schedule, when 90% of Americans are sitting for the great majority of these 16 hours of being awake, interrupting that with frequent, 5 to 10 minute interruptions of some light physical exercise. And then there's other things. Make sure that your sleep is, they don't compromise your sleep. You should have 8 hours of restful sleep. If you wake up in the morning and don't feel rested, there's something wrong with it. You have to really work on this. I would say that those are really the three major. Doing something for your mind, some meditative practice is clearly another component. And I've shown I've written about this in my books. All these 4 strategies, they interact. They all have been shown to influence the gut. They all have been shown to influence the gut microbes. And they all have been shown to actually contribute to healthy longevity. So I would say the recommendation is fairly simple, straightforward. And I think it starts with analyzing your own lifestyle and see how far are you deviating from that.
That's a depressing endeavor on this account. So thank you very much for your sage advice. For those listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode of Beyond the Balance Sheet podcast with Dr. Mayer, please like us on your platform of choice. Thank you, Doctor.
Thanks again for having me on your show.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Balance Sheet, a podcast designed to help advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families solve some of their biggest medical, psychiatric, and emotional challenges. Visit beyondthebalancesheet.com to read more about our guests and resources, and sign up for our newsletter.